This is Dave Winkler, the staff historian of the Naval Historical Foundation. Over the past year, I was privileged to hold the Charles Lindbergh Chair of Aerospace History at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum for the purpose of conducting research on the Navy's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley, CD-1. Based on materials gathered over the past year, today it is my pleasure to provide you a short overview of this unique pioneer of naval carrier aviation.
March 20th, 2022 marks the centennial of the commissioning of the Langley. Of note, the hull originally entered naval service 9 years earlier at California's Mare Island Naval Shipyard as the Collier USS Jupiter AC-3. The Navy had placed Jupiter and sister ships Cyclops and Neptune into service to address a lack of coal delivery vessels, a fleet vulnerability exposed by the around-the-world cruise of Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. Besides providing a hull, Jupiter's significance to Langley was its electric drive propulsion plant, a predecessor to the plant currently installed aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the ship's first commanding officer, Commander Joseph M. Reeves. Though the U.S. Navy first introduced catapult technology and landed the first aircraft on the deck of a ship, it was the British, pushed by the onset of World War I, who first converted warships and cruise liners into seagoing airports. American naval observers assigned with the Royal Navy recognized the potential offensive capability of ordnance-laden aircraft flying off of such vessels and urged their superiors in Washington to follow in Britain's wake. The sudden unanticipated end of the war and subsequent cuts in the shipbuilding budget dampened calls to match the British effort. Instead, some rather dramatic hearings before the Navy's General Board in the spring of 1919 led to a compromise recommendation that Jupiter be converted into an experimental aircraft carrier. Among those testifying before the General Board was Army Aviator Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Mitchell's eventual advocacy for a unified, independent air service that would incorporate naval aviation assets was seen as a threat even to a Navy brass that scorned the little flying machines. The Navy reacted by establishing a Bureau of Aeronautics to be led by the very capable Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, and to mount a naval aviation public relations blitz featuring Langley. Eventually, Mitchell's disparaging commentary on naval aviation would subject him to court-martial and a guilty verdict in December 1925. Though commissioned at the Norfolk Navy Yard early in 1922, significant work still needed to be accomplished before flight operations could begin. The biggest challenge proved to be the installation of arresting gear to trap aircraft. Lieutenant Alfred M. Mel Pride oversaw an ashore testing facility centered around a 100-foot diameter turntable that could be maneuvered to allow incoming aircraft to approach into a headwind. Eventually, a hybrid system incorporating cross cables attached to heavy weights and the British system of fore and aft wires and would be installed on Langley's flying deck. The arresting gear passed its first test on October 26, 1922, when Lieutenant Commander Godfrey de Courcelles Chevalier's Aeromarine 39B latched onto the fore and aft wires and sped ahead to a sudden stop, tipping the aircraft forward and busting its propeller. 9 days earlier, Lieutenant Virgil C. Griffin had piloted a Vought VE-7 off of the forward flying deck to record the carrier's first launch. On November 18, 1922, Langley's executive officer, Commander Kenneth Whiting, made the first catapulted, assisted launch off the carrier's deck. Whiting served as the second in command under Captain S.H.R. Stiffy Doyle, a non-aviator who took Langley down to Pensacola during the winter and spring months of 1923 to further refine launching and landing procedures. During this sojourn, Langley conducted flight demonstrations off Panama's coast for fleet commanders following the first of numerous fleet problems that would occur during the interwar period. While in Panama, Doyle and Whiting argued to their superiors that months of additional experimentation were needed to enhance the equipment and procedures that would be mirrored in Lexington and Saratoga. The two battlecruisers authorized for conversion to aircraft carriers thanks to the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922. Yet, with funding for Lexington and Saratoga not a foregone conclusion, and Mitchell arguing for a unified air service, Moffett curtailed the Doyle-Whiting experimentation plan by ordering Langley to the nation's capital for the June 1923 annual Shriners Convention. The carrier conducted flight demonstrations in the Potomac River and subsequently welcomed thousands of visitors from around the nation, including the Shriner-in-Chief, President Warren G. Harding. The positive Washington experience would be repeated in the coming months in New York, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Portland, Maine, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Massachusetts, and smaller New England municipalities that were celebrating their tricentennials. Langley opened the year 1924 participating in war games in the Caribbean, with its planes bombing the Panama Canal to block the passage of the enemy fleet and fending off attacking aircraft from shore-based airstrips. Having impressed the fleet commanders, the carrier finally returned to Pensacola to resume experimentation. In mid-June, Langley returned to the Norfolk Navy Yard to receive an upgrade to the arresting gear and a redo of the propulsion plant exhaust system. With Captain Edward "the Bald" Jackson now in command, Langley arrived in San Diego at the end of November, with the San Diego Union declaring, "Deadliest ship afloat arrives here," across its front-page bannerhead. Jackson adapted to a new routine as the carrier now berthed adjacent to the air station at San Diego's North Island, continued to conduct experimentation, embark and operate a fighter squadron, and serve as the flagship for Commodore Stanford Moses, who served as the Commander Aircraft Squadron's battle fleet. In February 1925, Fleet Problem 5 pitted two opposing fleets off Mexico's coast, with Langley's planes serving in a limited defensive role. Following in May, Grand Joint Army-Navy Exercise No. 3, centered on the Hawaiian Islands, had Langley flying missions to cover marine landings to recapture the islands from a hostile power. Langley operated within the Hawaiian Islands over the summer months, losing Lieutenant Commander Nathan Chase, a fighter squadron commander, in a mid-air collision that bumped him from his plane's cockpit. Of note, his replacement, Lieutenant Commander Frank "Spig" Weed, soon would be paralyzed in a freak domestic accident and go on to become a successful Hollywood screenwriter for such films as The Flying Fleet of 1929. Returning to the West Coast, Langley arrived at Mare Island Naval Shipyard for the first of a number of maintenance stays. There, Captain Joseph M. "Bull" Reeves awaited as the new commander, Aircraft Squadron's battle fleet. Reeves' arrival began the transformation of Langley from an experimental platform into an operational component of the U.S. battle fleet. Charismatic, a contemporary described Bull Reeves as a spellbinding orator. Gathering his aviators in San Diego, the new Commodore delivered what became known as the 1001 question speech, declaring, "I do not know the answer to these questions, and dozens like them any more than you do. But until we can answer them, we will be of little use to the fleet. That means we must become a school before we can become an air force." Langley would serve as that school. Ashore, Reeves pilots developed new tactics and applied them when deploying on Langley. During Fleet Problem 6, held in the Caribbean in February 1926, Reeves, having been delegated control of the Blue Fleet's air assets, ably defended the Blue Fleet's battle line and opportunistically attacked enemy combatants. As Reeves pushed for more efficient flight operations, the Langley leadership team turned over, with airship veteran Captain Frank McCrary as the new commanding officer, and Naval Aviator No. 3, Commander John Towers as the new executive officer. En route to Seattle, Washington, in August, Reeves tested the endurance of his air crews and flight deck personnel in an attempt to shatter the previous record for launches and landings in one day. Despite horrific weather conditions, the previous record was more than shattered, with the launching and landing of 127 aircraft. Placing that accomplishment in perspective, Royal Navy historian David Hobbs would write, "No British aircraft carrier would come near this record until well into the Second World War, even though most ships were bigger and better designed than Langley." Eventually, the temperamental Towers succeeded McCrary, setting up a tense relationship with Reeves, who continued to push the envelope at the peril of his air crews. For the spring and summer months of 1927, Langley participated in exercises with the fleet in the Caribbean, where the carrier's aircraft again disabled the Panama Canal. Following a presidential naval review and a port call to New York, Langley participated in additional exercises off Rhode Island. Returning to the West Coast, Langley's story nearly came to an early end when an aviation gas fire approached the main aviation gas stowage tank a few days before Christmas in 1927. The crew's quick reaction, paired with a little luck, to leave the ship with one fatality in a potentially cataclysmic event. With extensive repairs and an enlarged flight deck installed at Mare Island, Towers returned his ship to San Diego, with Reeves now determined to cram and operate 42 aircraft on a ship that was envisioned to carry no more than a dozen. Langley deployed in May 1928 to Hawaii, arriving south of Diamond Head early on the morning of May 17th. The small carrier launched 2 squadrons, totaling 35 aircraft, starting at around 4:37 a.m. Despite the defenders being forewarned of the intent of the exercise, the carrier's fighters conducting raids on Wheeler Field and other air bases in Hawaii. 13 years later, the Japanese would conduct a similar raid with devastating effect. With the arrival of the recently commissioned Lexington and Saratoga to the West Coast, Langley still maintained a critical role in the evolution of fleet aviation. As the only carrier capable of navigating within San Diego's shallow waters, Langley continued to serve as the qual ship for a generation of naval aviators who would eventually serve in command during World War II. During the early part of 1929, following another extensive yard period at Mare Island, Langley operated independently in the Caribbean to support Marines in Nicaragua and call on East Coast seaports. The carrier, now commanded by Captain Arthur Cook, returned to the West Coast in May to find that Reeves had been called back to Washington and Rear Admiral Henry V. Butler had relieved him. In contrast to the beloved Reeves, the enlisted sailors had contempt for Admiral Ty Butler, who insisted that ties on the back of their pants be formed in a square knot threaded right side over left. Fortunately, the crew would not have to spend much time having Butler looking over their shoulders, as Langley underwent a repair period at the Puget Sound Naval Yard near Seattle and then received orders to pair with Saratoga during Fleet Problem 10 to fight an enemy force containing Lexington in its order of battle. Held in the Eastern Caribbean, the subsequent Battle of Navassa Sea could arguably be called the first carrier battle in history. Unfortunately for Langley and Saratoga, clouds shielded Lexington's whereabouts. In contrast, clear skies enabled Lexington's attackers to put Langley and Saratoga out of action and enabled the Black Fleet to roll on to a lopsided victory. Following another fleet problem, the combined fleets headed up the East Coast for a presidential review, and Langley entered the Norfolk Navy Yard for an upkeep period. Back on the West Coast, Langley came under the command of Captain Rufus Fairchild Zogbaum. The son of a nationally renowned illustrator, Zogbaum welcomed Assistant Secretary for Naval Aviation David S. Ingalls and commentator Will Rogers to what was now dubbed the Covered Wagon for a memorable visit in which Ingalls, the Navy's first ace, obtained his carrier quals. In the spring of 1931, during another Caribbean fleet problem, Chief Air Pilot Vern W. Harshman flew into a cloud accompanied by other Langley aircraft only to emerge from the backside flying alone. Unable to find the mother ship, he ditched his aircraft. After a massive effort to locate him was abandoned, his rescue by a German tramp steamer made happy headlines for tabloids in a nation in the midst of a depression. Harshman eventually returned to Langley, now homeported in Norfolk. While on the East Coast, under the command of Captain Aubrey Ray Jake Fitch, the carrier headed up to Maine in the middle of winter to tackle the challenges of flight operations in frigid environs, and then welcome back Commander Mel Pride, who made the first carrier landing of a Pitcairn autogyro, the forefather of the modern helicopter. Langley then returned to the West Coast to participate in yet another fleet problem amid rumors that the Hoover administration was contemplating transferring the carrier to the Asiatic Fleet in response to hostile Japanese actions in mainland China. The officer selected to relieve Fitch, Commander Patrick N.L. Bellinger, anticipated conducting the change of command ceremony in Manila. However, with tensions easing in the Far East, he found himself taking command at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Langley stayed on the West Coast and was berthed at San Pedro, California in October 1932 when an earthquake rocked nearby Long Beach. As Bellinger and his wife escaped from a local theater, Langley crew members mustered to help with rescue efforts and to prevent looting ashore. Reassigned to the West Coast, Langley continued to participate in fleet problems and smaller-scale tactical exercises in early 1933 as changes in leadership occurred back east with the inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president and the tragic loss of Rear Admiral Moffett. Moffett perished along with 72 others when a storm felled the airship Akron off New Jersey's coast early on April 4th. Rear Admiral Ernest D. King would replace the legendary Moffett. Back on the West Coast, Captain Kenneth Whiting returned to command the ship that he put into commission. Unfortunately for Whiting, he failed to have his ship at a planned rendezvous location for a returning squadron of aircraft that was forced to ditch. Relieved after only 6 months in command by Langley's second executive officer, Captain Warren Child, Whiting would serve in the Navy until his passing during World War II, but he never achieved the rank of admiral. During Child's tenure in command, Langley again steamed to the Caribbean to participate in Fleet Problem 15 as a unit of the Blue Fleet commanded by the Battle Force Commander Admiral Reeves in maneuvers designed to have the Navy's carriers operate together in formation, a precursor to World War II's multi-carrier task groups. From the Caribbean, Langley again headed up the East Coast to participate in a naval review for the new Commander-in-Chief and called at New York and Newport. Returning to Norfolk, Langley handed over its experienced fighter squadrons to the newly commissioned Ranger and took on Marine Corps squadrons to form the first Marine Corps Air Group to deploy from a carrier. Returning to the West Coast, Langley steamed to Hawaii to participate in Fleet Problem 16, whose concept was based on a premonition that partly occurred during World War II, in which the Japanese captured the Aleutian Islands and Midway Island. Langley's Marine pilots gave good accounts of themselves in providing air cover for the counter-invasion force coming from the West Coast. Once back from the Mid-Pacific, Langley continued to serve as a testbed for new procedures. In a bold experiment conducted on July 30th, 1935, Lieutenant Frank Akers flew out from NAS San Diego with his cockpit hooded. Talked down via radio instruction, his airplane caught Langley's fourth arresting cable. By this time, Captain John Hoover had taken command. A big believer in tradition, Hoover went all in when Admiral Reeves ordered the whole fleet south below the equator to conduct the largest crossing of the line ceremony in recorded history, where nearly 30,000 pollywogs were inducted into the Royal Order of Shellbacks. The equatorial crossing and subsequent fleet problem would be a last hurrah for the collier-turned-aircraft carrier. Langley was slated to become a seaplane tender to service the new Consolidated Aircraft Corporation PBYs, which would be known as Catalinas during World War II. Captain Archibald Douglas would take the carrier through a metamorphosis that peeled back the forward third of the flight deck and added heavy lift cranes to the superstructure. Having been redesigned as a seaplane tender, Langley became the flagship of Commander Aircraft Base Force, the individual responsible for the Navy's seaplane and utility aircraft. The individual holding that billet, the aforementioned Rear Admiral King, sought to establish seaplane bases in remote locations ranging from Sitka, Alaska, to the French frigate shoals in the mid-Pacific. As a mobile seaplane base, Langley again participated in fleet problems as well as civic celebrations. For example, following Fleet Problem 18, which postulated the Japanese capture of the Philippines, With Hawaii standing in as the Western Pacific Archipelago, Langley headed to San Francisco to participate in the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge. Likewise, in early 1939, Langley would again enter the Caribbean for a fleet problem and head north for a presidential fleet review and for the opening ceremonies of the 1939 New York World's Fair. As Langley's crew joined with New Yorkers to marvel over such inventions as television, events overseas factored into the seaplane tender's immediate future. With Japan and China in open conflict, Langley was ordered to Pearl Harbor as a precautionary measure. With the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, Langley was then sent to Manila. Over the next 2 years, Langley provided the support infrastructure to host 2 squadrons of PBYs that would be designated as Patrol Wing 10 under the command of Captain Frank Wagner, who also commanded Langley into 1941. Captain Felix Stump, having relieved Wagner of his Langley duties in mid-1941, would be awakened early on the morning of December 8th on the opposite side of the international dateline to be informed that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Spared a similar attack that day due to the weather, Stump led Langley and 2 oilers out of Manila Bay through minefields and onto a southern passage, evading Japanese forces. Arriving at Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory, Langley's remaining aircraft would support Australian efforts against the Japanese submarine threat. Ordered to Fremantle in Western Australia, Langley left in time to avoid a devastating Japanese air raid against Darwin. Before departing, Captain Stump detached to serve with the newly formed Australian, British, Dutch, American Naval Command, leaving Executive Officer Commander Robert McConnell in command. With their homeland having fallen to the Nazis, the Dutch colonial rulers of the Netherlands East Indies feared Japanese invasion and prodded Washington to use Langley to transport a shipment of Army P-40 pursuit planes to Java to help defend against the Japanese aerial onslaught. Unfortunately, miscommunicated rendezvous points and Langley's slow speed exposed the carrier in broad daylight off the southern coast of Java on the morning of February 27, 1942. Japan's high-level, land-based naval bombers failed to hit what appeared to them to be an aircraft carrier during their first 2 passes. However, a third Japanese wave scored multiple hits and, combined with strafing attacks, forced McConnell to abandon ship. Remarkably, most of the crew survived and were picked up by the destroyers Whipple and Edsel. Most survivors were then transferred to the oiler Pecos. Soon, Pecos was attacked and sunk by Japanese carrier aircraft, with many more casualties incurred. Hours later, Whipple arrived to rescue the survivors before being forced to break off due to a submarine threat, leaving those remaining sailors in the water to meet their fate. News of Langley's loss was announced on April 4, 1942, after the next of kin had been notified by Western Union telegram. Most survivors continued to serve, with some serving aboard a new Langley, a light carrier placed in commission in 1943. However, Langley's true World War II legacy comes from the numerous aviators who gained their tactical experience flying off that small flight deck and applied that experience in the eventual defeat of the Japanese Empire.
Good morning and welcome to our show titled Fleet Air, USS Langley and the Dawn of American Carrier Aviation. If you like our content today, please hit subscribe, like, and the bell to receive notification of our future content. Our featured commentators for the webinar today are well known to all of you in our audience. Vice Admiral Robert F. Dunn, who commanded everything, and in fact, he's wearing his USS Saratoga commanding officer's ball cap, which we're really grateful for him to do. But he was the former commander of the Naval Air Warfare Command. He was the commander of Oppo 5 and the United States Air Force's United States Atlantic Fleet. We also have Vice Admiral Tom Kilcline, Naval Academy 53, former commander of Naval Air Forces Command, and our foundation historian and the author of the book USS Langley and the Dawn of American Carrier Aviation, Dr. Dave Winkler. The Norfolk chapter of the Navy League of the United States is hosting an invitation-only event next Sunday, March 20th, to commemorate the Langley Centennial, but also to honor the century of the aircraft carrier. And our panel today is exceptional, and they represent a knowledge base that covers that entire period of time, along with Dave Winkler. And I'll begin by asking Vice Admiral Dunn the very first question from our esteemed audience. Admiral Dunn, good morning. What do you believe was the most dangerous period for naval aviation specific to carrier operations, and why?
Actually, it was the early 1950s. And if I might quote from a book that I happen to have written on called Gear Up, Mishaps Down, about naval aviation safety, available from the Naval Institute, I believe. Figures tell the story. While those involved would be quick to declare that improvement must continue, from 1954, when naval aviation lost 536 people and 776 aircraft in 2,213 major mishaps, there has been remarkable improvement. That is a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, thank you, sir. We're going to come back to you on that. Dr. Winkler, can you follow up on describing the dual dates of March and November 1922 involving the commissioning, then deployment, more rapid milestones of aircraft launch and recovery of the Langley?
Sure. It's kind of interesting that we're celebrating the centennial on March the 20th, and it's kind of an artificial birthday in that the reason why Langley was commissioned on March the 20th was that, quite frankly, they had run out of funding to continue the construction from the Bureau of Construction and Repair. So to finish the job, they put the ship into commission early so they could draw on operations and maintenance funds. The commissioning on March the 20th was a very rushed, haphazard affair. Captain Doyle, the PCO, was not there. Right, the XO Kenneth Whiting took the ship and did the commissioning. They didn't even have a mast in place for the put the commissioning pennant. They actually put the pennant on the end of a broomstick and they hammered it to the side of the flight deck. So go ahead 6 months later. Now the ship is ready to go to sea, and it's in October and November where they conduct first the sea trials, and then finally the first flight operations, landing and launching. So I think that's going to be a more appropriate time to do some centennial celebrations.
Yeah, and of course we're going to participate in that as the Naval Historical Foundation, because we'll be bookending this March 20th event with our 5-star dining out in November. So thank you for that answer, Dr. Dave. So for you, Killer, I got a hot note from your classmate, John Balls Cotton, who said that I misspoke and said you're from the class of 53. You're actually from the class of 73. He's your classmate. And Admiral Dunn from the class of 51. So I correct myself. But in the era described by Vice Admiral Dunn, can you discuss the drastic and effective responses to the transition from fixed wing to jet aircraft and the enduring technologies, organizations, and steps the Navy enacted to enhance safety and flight deck operations?
Sure, Sonny, I'd be glad to. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's really good to see Admiral Dunn and Dr. Winkler. So in the early 50s, in the passage that Admiral Dunn read, several things were brought online that made a big difference in safety for the aircraft carriers. As we all know, they started out as a straight deck like the Langley. They went to an angled deck, which was a major refit to our carrier fleet, the carriers that survived out of World War II. There was an optical landing system they put on the flight deck, and it was in effect a mirror in the beginning. And that was, as Admiral Dunn told me earlier, that was not necessarily trusted by a lot of the air crew, and so the paddles was still played a big big part in getting the folks on board. Safety Center was brought online, and then my favorite, the NATOPS program was also instituted. The big blue books that we all learned how to fly our aircraft from, and all the procedures and understanding the systems. Those professionalization of the academic side, as well as the thinking through what it took to fly aircraft safely, made a big difference in the way we went into the late 50s from that very horrendous issue when you first started bringing jets on board aircraft carriers.
Thank you, sir. Now, the Ark Royal, I believe, was the first angled flight deck. And then in our Navy, it was the Antietam CV-36. And Admiral Dunn, can you describe the mirrored approach to landing and talk a little bit about that? And then I'm going to have Dr. Dave follow up to talk about Kenneth Whiting's rigorous enhancements of just filming carrier landings and things of that nature when he was commanding the Langley. So over to you, Admiral Dunn, to talk about the first angled flight deck and your memories of that and landing on them and things of that nature. What was the first ship that you landed on in an angled flight deck?
Well, the first ship was the, I have to think about that. Lexington was the first one with an angled deck. But if I may, I'd like to segue back to what was said just previously. The big improvement in aviation safety came due to a lot of things, but one of the most important things was the standardization of checkout in aircraft. And I'll tell you a little sea story. I was in a squadron, an air group, but in a squadron that was flying the AD Sky Raider, now the A1. And we also had the F9, F8 Cougar in that air wing. I had some very good friends who were flying Cougars, and I opined to them that I'd like to fly that airplane. And they said, well, we'd like to fly the AD. And so we went to our respective squadron COs and said, is it okay if we check each other out? And the answer was sure. So I got the flight handbook and I read through it, and they showed me how to start the Cougar. And then we took off from runway 31 at Alameda. And that was my first flight in a jet airplane. That's the way we checked out. Fortunately, it all worked out okay, but in a lot of instances, it did not work out okay. And that was one of the big reasons for the high accident rate. Back to your question, and I'm sorry for the segue. The first angled deck ship I landed on was Lexington. But before we landed on the angled deck, with an optical landing system, I might add, they came in almost simultaneously. We had to qualify on paddles first because nobody really trusted that mirror landing system. So we landed on paddles on the angled deck, and then we came around and we landed with the mirror. The interesting thing, I've mentioned this earlier, the angle was about 10 degrees, maybe 8 degrees, something like that, off the center line of the ship. And some bright scholar got the idea that why are we turning 190 degrees to land? Why don't we just come the other way and land only 170 degrees? So we tried for a short while making right-hand approaches to the deck, but nobody liked right-hand approaches. There's something in the genes of a naval aviator that says you've got to turn left.
Those are great stories. And keep bringing the sea stories. That's what everybody loves. Dr. Dave, you want to talk about Kenneth Whiting and
yeah, well, Whiting was the first XO, and Captain Stiffy Doyle, he was a black shoe. So, Whiting was really the one responsible for the development and landings and evolving flight operations. And I think it started because they had a cameraman and they filmed the landings. If you go to National Archives and you look up film in Langley, you'll actually see a lot of the footage. It's fast, and you saw it a lot of it in the program you just watched. However, film was expensive, so the cameraman would only record it if he thought it was going to be a crash. And when the pilot was approaching the aircraft, and if he saw the guy was cranking the camera, that was a signal that this was not going to end well. So they would bolt or pull off. And then legend has it that Whiting was actually kind of like signaling or tipping his hat, and the pilots would get guidance off of that. Next thing you know, you had a sailor out there holding two white caps, and you developed into the paddle system. The landing system. By 1924, you had a billet. The landing, the LSO was established. The paddles guy and guiding the aircraft down.
Well, what was interesting in my research with Kenneth Whiting was that whether he was filming landings or whether he jumped and grabbed a couple of rag hats and used them to enhance his visibility, which evolved into paddles, it was really never about destructive criticism. It was about constructive criticism. And we had a discussion a couple days ago with Killer talking about the instantiation of the facts that everyone is equal in the eyes of how you've landed. And can you talk a little bit about LSO feedback in the vein that we spoke of the other night, Killer?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. Having been somebody who was a junior officer, got waived by landing signal officers of great renown, from Bug Roach to Tar Baby McNair. I learned how to bring my airplane down, but the board on the ready room reflected that maybe not all my passes were perfect. And so you would have a brown pass, which would mean that you didn't do very well. A red one meant you did terribly. A yellow one meant that was average, and then a green one meant you did well. They call it the greenie board. Everybody in the squadron would walk in the ready room, from the most junior enlisted man to the CO, see that board, and from the CO and the other pilots on down, they were getting graded. And so you can imagine the humility that would bring to a naval aviator if you did not do well, or you had a pattern of not doing well compared to your peers, or even if you're the CO compared to the other guys in the squadron. So as you got more experience, normally those browns would turn yellow and then turn green, and pretty soon you were able to demonstrate to everybody in the squadron that you knew what you were doing around the boat. So the greenie board was a great tool. And like other tools that have been brought into naval aviation, it enforced a focus and a safety behind the boat. And so I thought it was very useful.
Admiral Dunn, what are your thoughts on this, sir?
Well, first of all, I don't. Killer's description is just fine. But for anyone who hasn't seen it and they'd like to see a real greenie board, they can go to the Navy Museum in the Navy Yard, and there's a ready room there. And in that ready room is a greenie board, and it will explain everything that whoever wanted to know about it. I assume the museum is still going on.
Yes, sir. And Ted Bronson, our late dear friend, that this was his ready room, and it is an absolute replica of his squadron ready room, and it's magnificent.
It is very good. But as far as the grading is concerned, yes, Hiller described it just perfectly. I have no comment on that, but grades began well before that. I remember when I first started making carrier landings, after the recovery, the LSO would come into the ready room with his little notebook, and he would say, "You started too high, you got too slow, you're going to kill yourself if you don't follow my signals," and that kind of thing. We didn't have the greenie board. I don't know what the origin of that is. That'd be an interesting research project for somebody. Which was the first one? Where was it? What ship, etc.
Well, sir, we'll find out, sir, and we'll let you know. That's the only correct answer to that. But can you tell us a little bit about, you spoke earlier that your very first carrier was the Monterey. Can you talk a little bit about the straight deck carriers that you served in? Just take us through that process to where you came and then ultimately landed and launched off of the Lexington.
Well, the CARQUAL carrier qualification in basic training. Let me back off. In those days, you had your basic training at Whiting Field and advanced training at usually one of the fields in Texas. But the culmination of the basic training was CARQUAL, carrier qualification. And the ship that was used was the Monterey, a CVL that had been launched sometime during World War II. It had a straight deck. It was a smaller deck than what we would get later on. But of course, the SNJ was a less performing aircraft, and there was no problem with it. It was a paddles pass. And before that, we had done field carrier landing practice with the LSO on a field. And some of the dimensions might be of interest to the newer folks here. We would come downwind, as a circular, an oval pattern actually, come downwind at 125 feet, begin our turn, beam the LSO platform ashore, but beam the island when you're afloat to compensate for the ship's motion. And as you made your turn, you would gradually lose altitude and change direction so that you were at the 45-degree point, the 90-degree point, you were, see, I don't have that straight. And I think you were about 60 feet at the 90-degree point. Then you keep turning and then you pick up the LSO and you follow his directions. In those days, there was more, you were supposed to fly your own pass because you knew where you wanted to land, but you had more LSO direction than you do today. With the optical landing system, the LSO doesn't normally direct you. You are directed by the position of the meatball in accordance with the datum lights on the mirror system, the optical landing system. But with the LSO, you didn't have that, and so you had to depend upon him to give you signals, and he give you a signal for a high or a low or a slow or a fast, etc., or your hook not down, that kind of thing.
Well, great, thank you, Dr. Dave. Any thoughts on kind of the origins of some of these technologies, glide slope indicator, meatballs, the mirrored landing systems? When they were introduced, and then maybe when they were sunsetted. Any thoughts on those?
No, it's basically the 1950s. I think we followed in the footsteps of the British. Doing World War II is was all LSO and paddles. So this is the era which Vice Admiral Dunn writes on. So
to be nitpicky about it, it was not it's not a mirror landing system anymore. It's an optical landing system.
Right.
But we actually started with a mirror. That is this mirror that would reflect lights that shone into it on a certain angle, and you could tell whether you were high or low by that reflection in accordance with what we call datum lights. And we still have datum lights, but everything's a little bit different.
Can you speak, Admiral Dunn, to your tenure as the director of the Naval Safety Center, and what were some of the imperatives that you may have introduced that are still enduring today?
Well, I'm not really ready for that question. The Safety Center in those days gathered statistics, and it published magazines. And some of you will remember Grandpa Pettibone and other such things that were there, and always published the results of accident investigations. And we learned from all of that. That's changed because of various factors, lawsuits and so forth. And everything is much more close hold. You cannot go to the Naval Safety Center website today and get any description of mishaps. They're not accidents, by the way, they're mishaps. It's just a different kettle of fish. We were very open We did have, I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, but we did have an investigative team. And if there were an accident and it was particularly serious, we would launch that team to the scene of the accident where they would provide the expertise for the accident investigation. I think they still have that. I'm not sure. I've been away from it for a while. But we tried to learn from anybody's mistake, whether it be a near miss or an actual accident or even a fatality.
Yes, sir. Well, I recall even as a destroyer man with a lamps debt on board or H3 debt, Driver Magazine was a tool that we used to keep ourselves, on our toes. And the recognition that Driver came was the pros of the week, and my ship were the pros of the week once, and we really appreciated being noticed. And it struck us in the fleet that this Naval Safety Center was a very vital, important command, and that mattered, and safety wasn't soft pedaled in any manner, shape, or form. And that's important to know, even with restrictions because of legal issues today. We've got a couple of questions from the field, and this is from Face Kennedy, former shipmate of mine. When was it instantiated that, or when did it become de rigueur that the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier would be an aviator? And I'm going to just open that up to anybody that has the first answer.
Let me
take that one. There was with Stiffy Doyle in command, I think there was a lot of lobbying behind the scenes. I think Kenneth Whiting, for example, went to Washington to lobby for legislation, and there was a board conducted, looking at the nation's, air defenses. It came out the Moral Board. And I think one of the things that came out of that was a requirement that, the CO of an aircraft carrier, have, wings. I'm trying to think of Edward the Bald. I don't know if he was an aviator. And now one of the things they did is there was a way you could qualify to be an air observer, and some of the COs of the Langley were air observers. But as far as, I think Captain McCrary was an air observer. Well, and then Towers was, I think, the actual first aviator to have command of the Langley.
But don't forget the influence of Billy Mitchell on all this. Billy Mitchell, the Air Force, Army Air Corps, wanted to take over naval aviation, including the carriers. And he would say things, look, you got this guy that doesn't even know how to fly an airplane in charge of the ship. And so his was a perhaps not well noticed motivation towards that.
Concur.
Okay. Did I lose everything?
No, you're good.
I think Sonny's gone. Hello, Sonny.
Oh yeah, I think we may have lost him. I guess we can do a little free-forming here. What do you think?
Yeah, go ahead. Go
ahead. Yeah. Well, shoot. One of the things that he mentioned that he wanted me to talk about a little bit was naval aviation and the folks who flew back on the Langley in the very beginning. Obviously, I wasn't there, and Admiral Dunn wasn't there, but we knew some people who were. And one of the things that Sonny had asked me to talk about a little bit was specifically my family. Now, my grandfather was a Silver Eagle. The Silver Eagles were enlisted pilots, and back in the beginning, they weren't sure whether how the squadrons would be constructed. Officers were enlisted, and so he was assigned to a squadron that had enlisted pilots. The CO and the XO were officers. He went to flight training in 1924, and in 26 got his wings with a class of 24, and then reported to the Langley. Now, back in those days, the Langley not only managed the aircraft in its air wing, but they also managed aircraft on the water, seaplanes. And so he started out by flying the seaplanes with a VJ-1 off the Langley. Did that until 1927, and then joined VT-2B, which was, again, the enlisted squadron. V-2T. They were the torpedo squadron on the Langley, flying T-4Ms. He did that until late 1927. So you can imagine he's right at the very beginning when they're doing their first fleet exercises and fleet problems. He then went to the right, which was the AV-1, which is the seaplane tender. Flew with those guys for a year and then came back again to the Saratoga this time instead of the Langley. Flew with V-2B on the Saratoga. Participated in Fleet Problem 9, Fleet Problem 12, and Fleet Problem 14, and left after Fleet Problem 14. So he was in the middle of a lot of the things that occurred there. Some of the stories that were told to me by my grandmother, because he died flying Catalinas during World War II, were the fact that at one point, when in his early career, when he was not still a naval aviation pilot, not a chief air pilot, he ended up flying a little too close to the Langley and flat hatting and took some rigging off the side of the ship and ended up putting an aircraft in the water. They held an investigation, and that's when they sent him over to the right. So a little inauspicious after making several trips, down to Panama and participating in fleet problems. He did that, then came back during CQ, which is something Naval Dunn mentioned earlier. He was trying to do a landing, and some folks went onto the landing field, so he had to fly a little high, landed a little long, and before they could get the aircraft back in the air, the aircraft flipped over, and actually one of the air crewmen was killed, and he spent a month in the hospital. Came back to the squadron again, but that wasn't unusual. My understanding is that during the time frame he was flying from the 1926 to 1933 in TAC Air, he lost 5 airplanes, or participated in 5 airplanes that were lost. I went from there to Catalinas and taught flying at the Naval Academy down in Pensacola, and then flew out of Quonset Point during World War II. He was down in Key West when he passed away during the war flying Catalinas. So little history as far as my grandfather went. My dad flew World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam. Was on the Forrestal when they had the fire, lost, he was the CO of his squadron, lost 5 of his 6 aircraft on the Forrestal fire. And then came back and ended up being a 3-star also, and was in charge of naval aviation in the Atlantic Fleet. You've heard a little bit about what I did as far as flying F-4s, F-14s, and F-18s, 40 years flying all the way through to include 2010. And my son is currently on the Reagan, flying out of Japan, flying F-18s. So 4 generations of carrier aviators, which is probably notable. Like Ernie Christensen, who has four generations of naval aviators. It's been something that's been our family tradition, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So I thought I'd just throw that out there. He asked me to talk a little bit about my family and specifically dwell a little bit on the time on the Langley.
It's quite a regal family. I'm back now. We have for those of you that are coming in from out of town, we have a horrific weather situation in the Northern Virginia area, and I guess we dropped
power. Where are you from? Miami? What's this horrific stuff?
No, it's not that horrific, but it caused a problem we've not had before. But I'm back. But there was a second question from Face Kennedy, and it was about when was the advent of the RAG squadron, and what was the background with that, the impact of the RAG system, its establishment, when it was established, and how it provided standardization and issues with previous ways that may not have been as effective. Any thoughts on that, Admiral Dunn, for you?
That was in the late 1950s when the RAGs were first formed. As a matter of fact, I'll apologize for a slight commercial, but it's in my book, and you can read about it there. Before the RAGs, the checkouts were much like I described earlier when friends of mine let me fly their Cougar. You would get to an airplane and read the handbook, maybe take a test, sometimes open book, sometimes closed, sometimes both, maybe a blindfold checkout, cockpit checkout, and then, okay, you're clear to launch. The first squadron I was in, I got in the airplane. I was scheduled for a flight with the operations officer, and this was at Alameda. And he says, "Well, are you ready to fly?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And so he said, "Okay, you take 607 and I'll take 601. I'll meet you over the San Mateo Bridge at 5,000 feet." Well, fortunately, I knew the San Francisco Bay Area, and I knew where the San Mateo Bridge was. So I took off and got to 5,000 feet and was circling for a while. Then it dawned on me, he just doesn't want me to meet him over there. He's going to make some sort of run on me. And so I looked up into the sun, and here he was making a high side pass on me. Well, that's the way we checked out in airplanes. That's changed considerably now. You go through a RAG, you get ground school, you get simulators, you get thorough cockpit checkouts, you take examinations, and it's a much safer way to do it. Now, granted, the airplanes are much more complicated too, so that was a requirement that we do something more than just a blindfold checkout and launch. Anyhow, this all began in the 1950s, and I forget the exact what the first squadron was, but it was, I think, probably at Miramar or somewhere in the San Diego area.
And Killer, do you have any reflections on that as well? Anything to add?
No, I don't think I do. I think Admiral Dunn handled the history and how those replacement squadrons were first initiated, and I was definitely a customer in that realm, going through different rags for different aircraft. But I don't think I have anything to add to how they were instituted.
Yes, sir. And I want to come to kind of a little bit different angle to a question. And I know that there's a lot of folks and there's a lot of urban legend and people that aren't knowledgeable speaking as if they're in positions of authority about the future Chinese threat and how does the USS Ford manage to do that. And I think I'd like to see if Killer, you can talk to in a similar fashion as you did the other night about the need for enhancing indications and warnings, anti-submarine warfare, things of this nature, and kind of share the fact that things really aren't that much different than they were in the Cold War. Anything to add to those thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to just get a couple of points out there. First of all, aircraft carrier, the large deck CBNs are an amazing piece of machinery. For those of you familiar with them, you get 700 miles on a ship in a 24-hour period. You're a moving airfield. Even though people say they're easily targeted, they're not when they go MCON. There are other ships that are actually just as large in merchant vessels and other vessels and ways you can create deception. It makes it very difficult to find this floating airfield. The issues associated with it is that 700 miles, they can get someplace and then operate for 2 weeks because the nuclear capability, they have fuel, ordnance, and stores on board to allow them to do that without having to have the logistics ships be right there, right then. The catapults give them the capability of putting large aircraft in the air, to including their own, AEW, airborne early warning, AWACS kind of aircraft, the E-2, carry large ordnance loads, and then have the range that they need to get to the targets that they need to operate against. And lastly, a ship that size, not only just because of the size of the ship, they're not easily put out of commission, and they can operate all the way up to Sea State 6. And anybody who's operated in the North Atlantic or the North Pacific or down on the Bight off of Australia knows that size makes a difference. And just between you and me, I've spent a lot of time looking at this. You can buy a smaller carrier and you'll get half the air wing for 2/3 of the cost. There's an efficiency there, but there's also an operational need to have a lot of different ships. So you have to, that's a trade that you need to work your way through. And one of the things we talked about earlier, Sonny, was trying to figure out the threats that the carriers are under. And so in that period of time in a near pure environment, you're going to need to be in a integrated air defense that not only includes your air wing, but it includes submarines and surface ships that handle anti-submarine warfare, anti-air warfare, and all the way down to and including deception for and cyber that takes on ballistic kind of missiles that can have an impact on you. That's how you survive. And if you go back to the Soviet ages, it was, we used to say you take the bomber on, you don't take the missile on. So you have to be able to have that extended integrated air and integrated sea defense in order to be able to take this weapon system into battle. And it is survivable because hypersonic and other kinds of missiles, if they do arrive, they cause an issue. They may cause a problem, but you have to be able to bring them out first. And the carrier itself, most of the time, matter of fact, my entire career was not in a near-peer environment where I was actually in combat in near-peer. Instead, we were projecting power ashore from Vietnam through Desert Storm and OIF and OAF, and you found yourself in positions of doing humanitarian work. Shoot, I mean, the Lexington provided power to Tacoma back in the 30s when that city had a major earthquake. And subsequent to that, we provided issues for Haiti, Indonesia, Banda Aceh when they had their issue, Japan when they had the issue with the nuclear reactor. You'll find even off our own coast, down off in the Gulf Coast, carriers have brought in a significant capability through helicopters and ability to make power in water. But that's not really the main issue. They're there to spend some time deterring aggression. And a little bit of a sea story. I'm sitting off of on the Indy. We're out in the Pacific, and some issues occur in Kuwait. Saddam decides to attack, and within about a week or so, we're off of in the North Arabian Sea with the Ike and the Indy. And we've got an air force that is as powerful as his entire air force. And you find that he stops where he stops. He doesn't go into Saudi Arabia. He doesn't continue. I firmly believe that you can send a signal to somebody, and more than that, the 6 aircraft carriers in Desert Storm do more than send a signal, but are a significant part with 300 fighter attack aircraft and 25 AWACS type aircraft to be able to have an impact on somebody who's from the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Gulf who's creating a problem. And then there's supporting operational diplomatic needs. I was unfortunate, but it was a significant issue for Desert One when we went into Tehran to try to spend some time pulling out the folks who had been taken hostage. All those helicopters came off of an aircraft carrier, an Operation Allied Force, which is not a lot is known there, but we had an aircraft carrier sitting off of Kosovo, and we moved it. And within 3 days of moving it, Milosevic went into and started that war. You send signals that you don't care, or you send signals that you care. And an aircraft carrier is the most significant type of platform that does that. So I've given you a long answer, but I wanted to make sure there was understanding of what an aircraft carrier can do, what it looks like, and then the impact it can have. So when you start talking about the Ford and the number of stories it can generate and the type of aircraft it can fly, whether they're unmanned or manned, and where it can operate with some impunity, it's a significant weapon system and one that's very vital to our nation. That's my view. Sorry about the long-winded
Yes,
answer.
sir. Admiral Dunn, you have some thoughts.
That was very good. I mean, that was a great view of the overall picture. Mine is a little bit more down in the grass, going back to an earlier question. And I'm referring to what I wrote myself. The beginning is the RAG. The first indication of the replacement air group beginning was the establishment of a fleet air gunnery unit at El Centro in May of 1952. It was recognized that there were differences in the way pilots were shooting, differences in in standardization, and so a fleet air gunnery unit, FAGU, was set up in May of 52. The next step was in April of 1955, a jet transition training unit was set up in Olathe, Kansas. This is where they were taking pilots who were mostly experienced in flying propeller-driven aircraft and qualifying them in jet aircraft. And that was very successful. The next thing that happened was in March of 1958, CNO approved a reorganization of naval aviation to and directing that there be a squadron set up, or there'd be squadrons set up on each coast to orient pilots reporting to a new squadron. In other words, the RAG. That's about it. But I thought there was a sequence of events here with a recognition that we needed some sort of specialized training. We needed some sort of standardization. It was all put together, and that produced what we have today, the replacement air group, or I guess they still call them RAGs, do they? But we've changed the names a lot. And before you go to a squadron, no matter how experienced you are, you go through the RAG before you go to your fleet squadron. And that's contributed markedly to an improved safety record, especially in light of more high-performance aircraft entering the fleet.
Yes, sir. Thank you. There's another question from the audience about the fact that several peer competitors, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, have this elevated ramp, incorporated a jump ramp. And the question is, why is that not something that we've thought was efficacious for our own Navy? I'll start with you, Admiral Dunn.
I'm not sure I have the answer for that. I know that it's been studied and it was decided that we would stick with catapults and a flat deck. Maybe Killer has something better on that.
Sure, I'll be glad to give you my 2 cents worth on it. The catapult, I'm gonna just give you an example of the JSF. The fact that you're able to use a catapult instead of a deck run, you can carry 6,000 more pounds of fuel into the air on the C versus the B. The AWACS platform, like the E2, in order to get that aircraft in the air to be able to give you early warning, requires a catapult. And if you want to put ordnance on an aircraft, it requires a catapult. I'll give you what my take, and this is fascinating to me, is that when the British were building their 2 aircraft carrier that they put to sea, their 2 new aircraft carrier, they looked very closely at the EMAL system, the electromagnetic launch system that they were putting onto the Ford, and they wanted to put that on their carrier, but it became a matter of cost. There is a cost to put that kind of a system on a carrier. You have to have more, in the electronic capability, you have to have more electricity, but if you're using steam, you have to have a significant amount of steam that goes to run those catapults. They take up room in the flight deck, but the biggest thing is cost. And so one of the things that I have found fascinating is if you can maintain the catapults, which isn't an easy thing to do, but our sailors do a great job at it. And if you can afford the catapults, your air wing is much more lethal and has much more reach and has much more SA in the air from the perspective of either offensively or defensively jamming and early warning. That's what they give to you. So long answer, but that's it. That's why you find our decks have a catapult as opposed to the ski launch. And by the way, when you look at the Russian and Chinese aircraft taking off of their flight decks, why don't you take a look and see how much ordnance is hanging underneath their wings?
That's a good
Sir
answer.
Admiral Dunn,
I have nothing
thoughts?
to add to that, no. What's that, Si?
Yes, sir. No, what I was going to say is ask if you had anything to add, but also
Not at all. I thought that was a very complete answer. Thank you.
Yes, sir. One of our guests has come in and said that the RAG is now referred to as an FRS.
Fleet Replacement Squadron. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So
sorry, I speak in the 20th century. I haven't gotten to the 21st century.
You speak very well, sir, and you're the aviators of today stand on your shoulder, your broad shoulders, and that's no lie. So we have the great audience, and we always get a good one. And we have Steve Wills, and if you know Steve, he co-wrote a book with Secretary Lehman called "Where Are the Carriers?" And forever he was at CNA, but he has now just left CNA, and he has reported to the brand new Center for Maritime Strategic Studies at the United States Navy League under the direction of our board member, Admiral Jamie Fogo. So Steve asked the question, and thank you for being here with us. You honor us with your presence. Will the MQ-25 be a transformative capability for the carrier in returning organic tanking to the CVN? And I'm going to send that one over to Killer first.
That's a great question. And I'm going to take it in two parts. First part is MQ-25 is going to be the first unmanned tactical aircraft on board the carrier, and it's not a small platform. And it's going to be integrated into an air wing, and it takes me right back to fleet problems. How do you take something that is new, experiment with it, and understand how you're going to operate with it? And I look at the MQ-25 as being that platform. I also look at the MQ-25 as something stepping to the next thing. When they talk about what they're going to do with next generation air defense, what the aircraft's going to be part of that as they go through NJAD, is what they call that particular acronym. The MQ-25 is going to help us learn what the man-unmanned team is going to look like in the future for a future air wing. The question, part two, tanking. The reason the MQ-25 is very important to us from a tanking perspective is the number of F-18s you have to sit on your flight deck with 5 big tanks on them in a refueling store is significant in a loss of a fighter that would be carrying ordnance or projecting power or providing fleet air defense. So by having the MQ-25, it's more than just the amount of fuel it can bring in the air, because an F-18 with those 5 big tanks, especially if it does a yo-yo, it takes off, refuels, and come right back and land on a mission tanker profile, can give a lot of gas. But just imagine if you had to take 10% or 20% of your fighters offline in order to do that. So the MQ-25 is actually a significant increase in our capability by having the dedicated platform and the amount of time it can spend in the air. In other words, it doesn't burn a lot of gas to give gas. That's kind of a reminder of the S3 that we used years ago. So 2 things. Number 1, it frees up TAC air, doesn't use a lot of gas while it's taking gas into the air. And the second thing is that we can experiment with it and lead us to the next thing.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Dave, you've been eerily quiet, and I'm going to bring you back into the room. A couple of things. I'm going to bundle some questions from the audience together. There was an assistant secretary of the Navy who got carrier qualified. Can you tell us who that was and a sea story about that? But then also, the Langley, I guess, was known once upon a time as the covered wagon. Can you talk about both those questions?
Yeah, in my research, the earliest I see as a reference to the covered wagon is kind of a 1928-29 time frame when the carrier was out in Hawaii. And I think the reason why it was called the covered wagon is kind of obvious. Is the flight deck was reminiscent of the old wagons that went across the West. As far as David Ingalls, who was the Navy's first ace, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he came out to San Diego with Will Rogers, the famous commentator, comedian, and Rogers was a big supporter of the Navy, and I think we named his submarine after him in the 1960s. Ingalls wanted to qualify, and they went through the briefing. Captain Zogbaum and Rear Admiral Reeves, briefed them and went through the procedures, and they did some. There was a flight deck at North Island, a simulator where he did some practices, and they said, be sure that when you approach, you drop your hook. And sure enough, when he made his approach, he forgot to drop his hook, and the paddles guy, the signal was to pound the deck. You need to drop your hook, and he didn't do so, so he got waved off, and he got waved off again, and he got waved off again. And finally, when the enlisted, wrote on a black chalkboard "hook" and waved it in his face, and and he dropped his hook and made his first landing. Will Rogers was, he was falling over on his side. He was laughing so hard watching this, and they all had a very, they had some good fun at Eagle's expense, and but then he got his quals, and so he might be one of the first assistant sec navs to ever earn a qualification, for his, flight deck landings.
Now, didn't the Langley have some unique features that were not found on other vessels? Can you describe some of those?
Yeah, the ship it actually had built with handball courts installed. It said that the ship used to be a collier, so they had enormous cargo space within. So they took advantage of that space to put in handball courts. They at one time, I think the ship had a miniature golf course in the little film. You saw the mast were retractable through the flight deck, so that you could steam at night, and you have the proper navigation light. So the ship had quite a few unique features. You saw the two stacks on the side; they would tilt over, to accommodate flight deck operations. And of course, the electric drive propulsion plant was unique. And the story behind that was that they commissioned 3 colliers. One was with 3 different plants. One had a steam turbine plant. One had the electric drive, and the one had the standard reciprocating engine. What they were doing is they were using these 3 colliers as test platforms for the future battleships coming into the fleet.
Yes, sir. And I've got another thought. I know that I believe it was Admiral Halsey that decided at a late stage in his career, maybe 06 pay grade, as a captain, to go to flight school. And the urban legend has it that and I haven't checked on Snopes or anything, but that they sort of just gave him his wings and said, just as long as you don't ever fly. But wasn't that really driven more than anything? I think maybe King fell into this as well, to become wing wearers, to circumvent any legal limitations on future jobs they may have in command. Or is there any truth to any of those legends?
Well, King certainly got his qualified late in his career, and I think he was captain, I think of the Lexington, and then he goes on to, but he certainly got qualified late, as did Zogbaum, and the challenge was that the Navy needed qualified senior officers to command these ships, and these pilots coming up through the ranks weren't coming up fast enough. So they had to encourage some of these senior officers to get their wings, and that certainly was the case with King. And and Halsey comes along a little later, and he gets his quals.
Right. Well, good. So thank you for that. So a couple other questions that are out there. Can we talk about Marine Corps aviation as a capability within a carrier air wing? And Admiral Dunn, I know you mentioned that when you flew off the Lexington, and of course in the Sarah, when you commanded Sarah, you had a Marine Corps squadron. Can you talk a little bit about that, sir?
Actually, when I was an air wing commander, I had a Marine squadron in my air wing. And once you got away from the ship, they were as good as any squadron, any Navy squadron you'd ever find. The problem is that they did not have a lot of experience on operating around the ship. There were some very colorful times for us, and I have mentioned that to some of my Marine friends. For example, and I'll only give you one story. We were in the Mediterranean. It was a beautiful day, ceiling and visibility unlimited all the way to the moon, 30 knots of wind across the deck. And we were recovering aircraft, and this Marine came, A4 by the way, A4 Skyhawk. Marine came in. He looked good. He got a little high, then he sank a little bit low. He added power at the request of the LSO. He went over the top, as we call it. In other words, he went up and he landed forward of the number 4 wire. And now what you're supposed to do then, and I guess most of our audience knows this, when you touch down on deck, you're supposed to go full throttle. For some reason, he did not go full throttle. I'm not sure what throttle he had, but it was certainly less than full. And he went off the angle, and I happened to be in primary at that time and saw this happen. And he almost disappeared from view, and we thought we'd lost him for sure. But pretty soon we saw a big rooster tail as he added power, and he climbed up, and he must have, I think he set a new altitude record. We called him and got him settled down and said, okay, now when you come back, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good Marine. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And so he came around and again, he he's looking good until he got in close and he took off a little bit too much power. Then he added power, went over the top, landed long, added 100%, aircraft lifted off the deck, and he punched out. So that was my experience with that particular group. But having said that, and that's a good sea story, the Marines do a great job. They go through flight training just like the Navy does. They have good RAG training. They are particularly good at, in general, they're particularly good at ordnance delivery. And I'd be glad to have a squadron in my air wing anytime.
Killer, any thoughts to add on that? Any sea stories?
Sure. Well, I hesitate to tell too many sea stories about my Marine friends, but I will say that that throughout our history, and Dr. Winkler mentioned this at the beginning, Marine aircraft have been operating off of our aircraft carriers. The Marines dedicate currently 3 squadrons to rotate to go to sea with our aircraft carriers. They bought part of the Marine Corps Aviation program. They bought F-35Cs, the carrier version, so that they can be assigned to an aircraft carrier and fly off the aircraft carrier and use the catapults. Truly integrated. And I've operated with some Marines that, operating around the boat were just as good as anybody you saw. I think Admiral Dunn's point was well taken. I was on the Coral Sea when he brought 2 F-4 squadrons out there and they weren't planning on coming out because we had to take our 2 squadrons and go to the Roosevelt, the old FDR. And those 2 squadrons brought 20 pilots per squadron with an anticipation that they would lose about 25% of them in this qual process, just because they hadn't been to sea in such a long time. Extremely interesting evolution. And the only sea story I'll tell, because there's no names associated with, was an individual's coming around a couple of times having some problems, and then at the 180, he just, instead of continuing left, banked a right-hand bank and started climbing and left the pattern. Their boss came up and said, what's your intention? He came back, we're declaring an emergency, we're heading back to the beach. And the boss said, what's your problem? He said, oh, I've got an O2 light, meaning he was done. The O2 is the oxygen system, and he just wasn't going to do this anymore. So you end up with, by the way, I had nothing to say about whether the Marine was a good pilot or not a good pilot. That day, that he had his time in the barrel. And trust me, I've had my time in the barrel. And I just thought that was pretty humorous when he said, I've got an O2 light, I'm declaring an emergency. So Marines are
Yes, sir.
part of carrier aviation.
One of the things I wanted to add was that Major Katie Higgins Cook, Marine Corps Major Katie Higgins Cook, is our first Blue Angel, and she's superb, and she's a terrific pilot, and I just give props to her on that. Well, as we close our show for the for this month. First of all, great thanks to Dave Winkler for the historical context of where all this began. But, the future of our carrier aviation is very bright, and it's still the cornerstone of our national foreign policy. And so given that, I'd like to go around the panel and just have you share your last thoughts. And I'll begin with you, Dr. Dave.
Oh, no, I was going to follow up just to say with the Marines, we just had a squadron deploy with the Royal Navy, the Queen Elizabeth. So I think not only do we have our own, aircraft carriers, but we're working with other countries now. One other thing to add is there's the aircraft carrier, but what has really evolved over time is the airplanes themselves. You think about it, the flight deck hasn't changed much since we introduced the Forrestal to the fleet in the 1950s. But the capabilities of the aircraft today make when you think about it, 30 years ago, you would target 10 aircraft against one target. Now you target one aircraft against 10 targets. That's so much more capability. So I can see the aircraft carrier being a major component of our defense posture for years to come.
Admiral Dunn, I'm going to let you have your last comments, but I want to commend to the audience your great book, Gear Up, Mishaps Down.
Thank you.
The Evolution of Naval Aviation Safety, 1950 to 2000. He's holding it up right now. Get on the Naval Institute Press. You order that book now, read it, commit it to memory, and maybe a few shekels will make their way to Vice Admiral Dunn's wallet so he can take me to lunch at Athena Palace. So over to you, sir, for your final thoughts.
Thank you for the commercial, Sonny. And if any money comes
Yes,
in,
sir.
It'll go to the Naval Historical Foundation. How would that be?
Thank you, sir.
I was privileged to be able to talk to an F-18 pilot. He came by the house about a month ago, I guess 2 months ago. He was a grandson of a fellow who I had been at the safety center with, a fighter pilot. But this grandson had just come back from a cruise, and I forget the ship, I apologize. But they were continually underway for 3 months. And apparently that's not an unusual thing these days. And I think this is going to be, if not the death of, at least inimical to naval aviation, the carrier aviation, if we can't do something about the schedules and get some relief for those people. Now, it's nice to be at sea and have a field day and have the day when you can go on the flight deck and have a beer and all that kind of thing, but that's not the same as getting ashore every once in a while, and it's certainly not the same as looking forward to being home in 6 weeks. I hope something will be done about that.
Thank you, sir. And some final props to you in the sense that you were our former Naval Historical Foundation president, and your work was phenomenal on our behalf. And we thank you for your sponsorship of the NROTC Leadership and Essay Contest that we always get great inputs, and it's named after you, as it should be. And your service endures, and it was phenomenal, and we thank you.
Thank you.
Killer, your final thoughts, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Admiral Dunn's brought up an interesting point. As I mentioned earlier, my son's a F-18 pilot, a lieutenant commander, department head right now. COVID has had a tremendous impact on our folks and their ability to pull into port, and making an entire deployment like that reminds me of, when some of our early IO deployments when we first in the early 80s, late 70s. That has to change, but that's something that the Navy is really paying attention to right now, and hopefully post-COVID they'll be able to start pulling back into port. I'd like to commend 2 articles in the Naval History magazine published by USNI, one by Dr. Winkler, one by Mr. Palmer, talking about the Langley. If you're interested in some sea stories, I recommend you get the Naval History magazine. And then in a recent article back in March, Succeeding in Periods of Change in Proceedings magazine, I also recommend that you read that. It's a tremendous article. It talks about fleet problems. It talks about simulations. It talks about how you do wargaming and experimentation, and and then recycle and understand what you have and how to make it better. Continuous learning is extremely important in our business. So I recommend those articles. And thank you, Sonny, for allowing me to be here and sitting next to Admiral Dunn. It's truly a privilege. And Dr. Winkler, I love reading what you put out. So thank you all.
Thank you, sir. And the Naval History magazine is an amazing periodical. And one of our viewers today, Paul Stillwell, was a longtime editor of that magazine. And again, all naval aviators today stand on the broad shoulders of you both, and Admiral Kilcline and Admiral Dunn. And I want to reach out to the audience and thank you all for your attendance, your great questions, and your shared stories that contributed to our show. We thank Colin Masso for his narration and our panelists for their ringside seat analysis and reflections today. And we look forward to reading Dr. Winkler's book on Langley when it is ultimately published. It will be a must read. If you enjoyed our show, please hit like, subscribe, ring the bell to receive our future content. And I want to close our program today with the fourth verse of the Navy hymn, which was incidentally written in 1915 by Mary Hamilton. And in the words of this, I think stand as a great recognition, but also as a prayer. Lord, guard and guide those who fly through the great spaces in the sky. Be with them always in the air, in darkening storms or sunlight fair. Oh, hear us when we lift our prayer for those in peril in the air. Have a phenomenal day. Thank you for viewing, and we look forward to seeing you next month.